It started with the sound of silence. Not the peaceful kind, this was the eerie kind. The kind that blankets a lakeside morning when something's wrong. I walked out to the dock with a fresh cup of coffee in my hand, expecting to see the glimmering reflection of my boat gently bobbing on the water. Instead, there was nothing. Just empty ropes dangling, swaying slightly in the breeze like they were searching for something they'd lost. My heart sank. I blinked twice, thinking maybe I was still half asleep. But no, the boat was gone. My custom 17-foot tracker base boat, fully rigged, newly painted navy and white with the name Blue Justice on the side. She was more than a boat. She was a gift from my late brother, a war vet who'd found peace fishing these waters after his tours. That boat held memories I couldn't replace, even if I had the money to, which I didn't. At first, I thought maybe someone had taken it as a prank, or maybe my teenage nephew had borrowed it without asking. But after a few frantic phone calls and a jog down to the neighboring docks, reality set in. It had been stolen. I stood there, the dock beneath me creaking like it could feel my fury, staring out at the lake that now felt foreign, cold, violated. I called the sheriff's department. Immediately, Deputy Mills showed up within 30 minutes, a clipboard in one hand and a styrofoam cup in the other. He was kind, in that small-town way, but it was clear this wasn't going to be an urgent matter for them. Probably some kids from out of town. Happens this time of year, he said, scratching his chin. I shook my head. No, this wasn't some joyride. Whoever took it knew how to launch and move a boat without a trace. They even closed the dock latch behind them. He raised an eyebrow at that, but just scribbled on his notepad and promised to circulate the boire description. As he got into his cruiser, he paused. You didn't hear this from me, he said, leaning out the window. But I'd ask around the HOA. Some of your board members have been real active lately. He pulled away, leaving dust and 100 questions in his wake. The HOA. I'd bought this lakefront property 2 years ago, a modest A-frame cabin with a wraparound porch, and had spent most of that time fixing it up. My plan was simple: live quietly, fish often, and mind my own business. But that wasn't good enough for them, especially not for Eleanor Blackwood. Eleanor was the HOA president, a self-proclaimed guardian of community standards. Tall, thin, always in beige slacks and a matching visor, she had the sort of polite smile that made your skin crawl. From the day I moved in, she made it clear she didn't want me or my boat here. She'd complained about everything. The color of my porch chairs, the American flag on my dock, even the size of my tackle box, which she once said looked unkempt from across the lake. I'd done my best to comply where I could and push back where I needed to. But it was never enough. Then 3 weeks ago, the HOA sent me a formal violation notice for unauthorized dock expansion. I hadn't expanded anything. I'd simply replaced old boards and added a few solar lights for safety. I submitted photos, receipts, and a detailed explanation. They ignored it. 2 days later, I got another notice. I had 15 days to remove my boat from the water or face fines. The reason? Exceeding community size and weight regulations for private vessels. It was absurd. My boat was well within standard specs. I appealed, of course. That's when the harassment started. Parking tickets on my own gravel driveway. HOA agents taking photos of my backyard. Random inspections by compliance officers looking for mold on siding or improper grass height. And now, my boat was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch with a legal pad, writing down everything that had happened over the last month. Dates, times, interactions. I even installed a trail camera at the edge of my property, aimed toward the HOA clubhouse parking lot next to the lake. I didn't know what I was looking for. Until 2 days later, the footage showed me everything. The footage was grainy, but the timestamp was clear. 3:12 a.m. A pair of taillights rolled slowly down the clubhouse access road, headlights off. A dark SUV backed down the slope toward the lake. 2 figures emerged, their movements efficient, practiced. They released my boat from its tie-downs and glided it into the water like it was theirs. Then came the moment that nearly made me throw the laptop across the room. As the SUV reversed and the boat floated out, one of the figures turned toward the camera. The motion light on my dock flared for a split second, just long enough to catch her face. It was Eleanor. I stared, frozen. The president of our HOA had stolen my boat. I downloaded the video, made 2 backup copies, and drove straight to Deputy Mills's office. This time his tone changed. "Are you absolutely certain that's her?" he asked, watching the clip again and again. "I'd bet my life on it," I said. "And you should too. She's not just a busybody. She's a criminal." Mills leaned, back in his chair. "Well, now this is more than just a missing boat. If that's her, and it sure looks like it, we might be dealing with felony theft." That was the moment the storm began to gather. Eleanor must have gotten wind of the investigation quickly, because the very next day I received a cease and desist letter. Her lawyer accused me of defamation and unlawful surveillance. She was doubling down. I knew I needed help. Real help. So I called Walter Browning, a retired attorney who had once sued the city for trying to drain a wetlands reserve, and won. Walter lived just up the hill and had become something of a legend among those who clashed with local bureaucracy. He met me the next morning with a black coffee, a notepad, and an unmistakable fire in his eyes. "She's gone too far," he said, after watching the footage. "And I think she knows it." Walter advised me not just to press charges but to go federal. "Eleanor transported stolen property across state lines," he said. "That's not just HOA harassment anymore, that's interstate theft, which means we loop in the FBI. I blinked. "You really think the feds would care about a stolen fishing boat?" Walter smiled grimly. "They will when they find out. What's stored inside it?" I stared at him. "What are you talking about?" He leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's been an open investigation into misuse of HOA funds across several communities, including this one. I've had my suspicions for a while. If your boat was used as a vessel, literally, for moving documents or assets related to that, it could tie her to bigger charges." Suddenly it all made sense. Eleanor's obsession with controlling every detail of the community, the absurd inspections, the attempt to get rid of me. I wasn't just a nuisance, I was a threat. The following morning, Walter and I met with a field agent from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. We showed them the footage, the HOA violation letters, and our timeline of events. The agent listened quietly, taking notes. By the end of the meeting, he closed his folder and said 3 words I'll never forget. "You're not crazy." That night, I returned home to a cold, quiet cabin. I stood on the dock again, staring out at the dark water where blue justice used to float. But I didn't feel helpless anymore. I felt something sharper. Purpose. Eleanor had no idea what was coming, and 2 days later the knock on her door wasn't mine. It was the FBI. They say neighbors can be your biggest blessing or your worst nightmare. I never expected mine to be both in the same month. It started on a quiet Sunday morning. The sun had just begun casting golden ribbons across the lake, and a light mist curled off the water like smoke from a sleeping dragon. I was sipping black coffee on the porch of my lake cabin, my grandfather's old place, passed down to me after he died last winter, when I noticed something strange. My boat was gone. Not floating crookedly, not tied in a different position. Gone. I walked down the dock slowly, like I might be wrong, like maybe I'd forgotten I'd moved it. But no. My boat, a vintage 1972 Boston whaler I'd spent months restoring, had vanished. The ropes were still tied off. Cut clean. No signs of a break-in. Just missing. My heart sank. I scanned the shoreline. Across the narrow end of the lake I saw her, Karen Delaney. Every neighborhood has a Karen, but Lakeside Shores had the Karen. HOA President Emeritus. Mercedes driver. Dog named Wellington. Hair always perfectly blown out like she'd just stepped out of a courtroom drama. Her deck overlooked the lake from the north side, and that morning, something sat moored to her dock. Something that looked eerily like my boat. I grabbed a pair of binoculars. There it was, my registration number still visible under the glare of the rising sun, duct tape clumsily peeling off in an attempt to cover it. My boat, sitting at her dock like it had always belonged there. What would you do, call the police? I did, first thing. Then I called the HOA office and demanded someone explain what was going on. I didn't expect what came next. Officer Ramos showed up an hour later, shaking his head before he even stepped out of his cruiser. She says it was confiscated by the HOA, he said. Apparently, there was a complaint about it being an unauthorized vessel. Unauthorized? I barked. I've had that boat on this lake for over 10 years. My grandfather before me for 20. What the hell gives them the right? He raised his hand, calm but tired. I'm not here to take sides, but I can't remove the boat from her dock unless there's proof it was stolen. And technically, the HOA claims they sent multiple warnings. Which they didn't, I snapped. Not a single one. But he just nodded slowly, apologized and left. No paperwork, no report. Just a shrug and a retreat. I knew then. I wasn't just dealing with a neighbor dispute. This was a power move. An HOA power play. And I wasn't about to play defense. Stormed over to the HOA office. An off-white trailer with a dying ficus out front and a plastic gold eagle above the door. Their so-called legal affairs manager was Marcus Reed, a man who looked like he'd failed upward through every job he'd ever had. He met me at the door with a smug little smirk and an envelope in hand. We sent the notice to your old billing address, he said, not even pretending to apologize. According to the HOA bylaws, boats docked in violation of community rules are subject to impound. This isn't a marina, I said through clenched teeth. It's a lake. And that dock has been mine since 1978. He shrugged. Your grandfather was grandfathered in. You're not. I walked out before I lost my temper. Back at the cabin, Emma, my girlfriend and part-time legal assistant, was waiting with her laptop open. She'd been listening to my rants and had already pulled up the HOA documents online. They can't legally impound anything unless it's on common property, she said, scrolling rapidly. Your dock is on your deeded parcel. That's private. Shoreline, Charles. The HOA has no jurisdiction over your boat unless it was left on communal land. Exactly, I said, which it wasn't. She looked up at me, her eyes sharp. So this wasn't a mistake, it was theft. I nodded. Petty theft, maybe. But premeditated. They wanted the boat gone. But why? She whispered. That question kept me up most of the night. The next morning I filed a police report, but I already knew it wouldn't go anywhere. Officer Ramos was polite but firm. This was a civil issue. I'd have to take it up with the HOA in court if I wanted my boat back, so I decided to go one step further. I called Walter. Walter Shepard is a retired Navy JAG officer who now works as a quiet lakeside real estate consultant. He also happens to be my grandfather's best friend. I told him everything. The boat, the fake impound, the smug smile on Karen's face when she saw me staring from across the lake. He listened carefully, then gave a slow nod. Sounds like they overreached. Overreached? I laughed. They stole from me, and you'll get it back, he said. But let's not think small here. If they're brazen enough to steal a boat, what else have they gotten away with? That was the question that cracked it all open. Within 2 days, Walter and I were knee-deep in HOA filings, past board meeting minutes, and property records. Turns out Karen had been trying for over a year to push through a special construction initiative, a new community fishing dock to replace the old one that had collapsed 2 winters ago. But here's the catch. The best location for the new dock was right next to my lot. Building there would mean removing visual clutter from the adjacent shoreline, which included, among other things, my vintage boat and dock. In other words, my boat wasn't just stolen, it was strategically eliminated. Emma leaned over my shoulder, reading the same documents. She thinks if she clears the area, she can claim the easements unoccupied. Then the board greenlights the new pier. And her property value jumps by 50 grand, I muttered. That's what this is really about. Walter nodded. If we're right, that's fraud. That's abuse of power. But proving it? I sighed. That's the easy part, Walter said with a gleam in his eye. We just need to find the right people, people who've been burned before. The next 48 hours were a flurry of phone calls, quiet meetings on back porches, and emails exchanged in whispers. It turned out I wasn't the first target, not by a long shot. There was Sophia Lynn, whose birdbath was removed by HOA order for being ornamental clutter. George Winters, fined $200 for planting tomatoes in his backyard because edible landscaping was against policy. Even a 78-year-old widow, Helen Pratt, who had been denied permission to install a wheelchair ramp because it disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the community. All of them had stories. All of them had documents. And all of them, once I explained what happened to my boat, were ready to talk. The final piece of the puzzle came from a quiet man named Henry, who had lived at Lakeside Shores since the early 70s. He met me one evening at the marina, holding a single sheet of yellowed paper. "This is from the original deed," he said, "before the HOA was even formed. That section of the lake, including your dock, is protected under state riparian law. The HOA can't regulate it." I stared at the paper, my mind racing. "They didn't just steal your boat," Henry said quietly. "They violated state law." That night I sent every shred of evidence to a contact Emma had at the County Land Management Office. I also included a formal complaint to the State Attorney General's office, requesting an investigation into Lakeside Shores HOA for abuse of authority and possible fraud. Karen didn't know it yet, but by stealing my boat she'd launched a battle she couldn't win, because this wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about justice, and I was coming for her. The first time I saw Eleanor Blackwood, she was holding a clipboard like it was a scepter, issuing orders to 2 contractors at the lakefront entrance. Her posture was rigid, her jaw set, and the HOA badge pinned to her blouse glinted like a sheriff's star in the morning sun. I knew immediately, this woman wasn't just a board member. She was the type who liked control, demanded compliance, and didn't take kindly to being told no. I had only inherited the cabin 6 weeks earlier, a weathered but solid lakefront property that had belonged to my late Uncle Frank. He'd spent the last 2 decades avoiding HOA meetings and building up goodwill with the older neighbors, most of whom remembered when the lake community didn't even have streetlights, let alone governing bylaws thick as textbooks. The cabin came with a private dock, modest but sturdy, built before the HOA had ever existed. It was grandfathered in, fully legal, and more importantly, it had always been a cornerstone of the community's annual fishing festival. Eleanor didn't care. Not 2 days after I moved in, a letter arrived. No greeting, no welcome, just a typed notice with 3 bolded sentences. Dock is non-compliant. Must be removed within 14 days. Failure to comply will result in daily fines. No signature. Just the HOA letterhead and a printed return address. At first I thought it was a mistake. My uncle had always said the dock was protected under grandfather clauses, and sure enough, when I checked the county records, it was listed as a pre-HOA structure with full legal rights. But when I brought this up to Eleanor, standing beside her white SUV in the HOA office parking lot, she gave me a tight smile and said, "Community standards evolve, Mr. Turner. Old exceptions don't always reflect current priorities." The tone was polite. The threat behind it wasn't. I knew better than to escalate immediately, so I filed a formal appeal and waited. In the meantime, I kept to myself, worked on clearing brush around the cabin, and spent my evenings on the dock with a rod and a beer, trying to find some peace. Then the orange flags appeared. Small plastic markers, bright and unnatural against the soft lake grass, marching in a straight line from the community park to the shoreline less than 30 feet from my dock. I followed the trail to a set of stacked lumber and metal beams dropped off by a contractor truck, unmarked but familiar. The same crew that had been at Eleanor's side weeks ago. Curious, I struck up a conversation with one of the workers. He was friendly enough until I asked what the pier was for. "HOA's building a new community fishing pier," he said, thumbing toward the deeper section of the lake. "Right here. Piles get driven next week." I blinked. "Here? This area is a spawning ground. Bass come here every season." He shrugged. Just following orders. By the next morning, an official announcement was posted on the HOA bulletin board and emailed to residents. A new pier project, funded by a recent increase in dues, would be built to enhance community engagement and promote shared access to the lake. It sounded wholesome, noble even. But the pier's planned location overlapped nearly ideal, completely with the shallow crescent-shaped bay that had long been the heart of the lake's natural breeding cycle. I wasn't just angry. I was stunned. That evening, I emailed Eleanor and the rest of the board a detailed concern about the environmental impact. I included photos of base nests, pale divots in the lake bed, already forming early in the season. I even attached a letter from a local wildlife biologist, Dr. Daniel Pike, who had studied the lake's ecosystem for over a decade and confirmed the area was a critical spawning habitat for spotted bass, protected under regional wildlife guidelines. 3. Days passed. No response. On the 4th, a new notice arrived at my door. Dock remains non-compliant. Fines will now accrue at $100 per day. They weren't just ignoring me, they were accelerating the pressure. I tried to remain calm. I contacted a local attorney and verified that my dock's status was still legally protected. He agreed. They're trying to force you into submission, he said, but they have no legal grounds to remove your dock, unless you let them. Emma, my girlfriend, saw the tension building in my jaw as I read the notice aloud. She placed a hand on my shoulder. You're not backing down, right? No, I said. This isn't just about the dock anymore. I started documenting everything. Photos, emails, copies of HOA notices. I requested public records on the pier construction permits and found something strange. The environmental impact assessment, required by state law for new shoreline structures, hadn't been completed. There was an application, there were contractor bids, but no finalized report and no clearance from the Department of Natural Resources. They had started construction without approval. I forwarded everything to Dr. Pike, who took one look and said, "This is a violation waiting to happen." He offered to submit a formal complaint to the state, and I agreed. Within a week, the DNR responded. The permit for the pier was suspended pending investigation. A large white sign appeared at the construction site. Notice of environmental review. All activity halted. The news hit the community like a thunderclap. Eleanor called an emergency HOA meeting the next evening. The community center was packed, standing room only. I sat near the back, arms crossed, watching Eleanor pace at the front like a general before battle. "Mr. Turner," she said loudly, "has taken it upon himself to sabotage a project that would benefit every family in this community. Because of his actions, our annual fishing festival is now at risk. You all know how important this event is for our children, our summer, our identity." She turned to face the crowd. "I ask you, should one man's personal grudge end a 40-year tradition?" The murmurs turned angry. Eyes shifted toward me, some confused, some hostile. But then Victor Ramirez, a father of 3 and a lifelong resident, raised his hand. "Did we even get environmental clearance for the pier?" he asked. Eleanor stiffened. "The permit is under review, but that's standard procedure. It's not standard to break ground before approval," Victor countered. Others began to whisper. I stood. "Have you told the community about your connection to Lakeview Construction?" I asked, projecting my voice. "The same company that's building the pier, and the same one your husband partially owns?" Gasps. Someone dropped a water bottle. Eleanor's face went pale, then red. "That's irrelevant and slanderous," she snapped. "This meeting is adjourned." She slammed the gavel and stormed out. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. I had planted a seed, and I knew it would grow. Back home, I logged onto the community forum and posted everything. Not an angry rant, not a personal vendetta, just the facts, the base nests, the construction violations, the financial conflicts, and the potential ecological damage. I invited questions. I offered to walk residents through the spawning grounds, show them the impact firsthand. The response shocked me. Comments flooded in, not just from skeptical residents, but from concerned families, fishermen, even local teachers who had used the lake as a nature learning site. People were angry, but not at me. Not anymore. They were beginning to see the truth. This wasn't about preserving my dock. It was about preserving the lake. And Eleanor had just made her first irreversible mistake. I never imagined I'd become public enemy number one in a sleepy lakeside community, but the moment the HOA blocked my access to the dock and laughed in my face, I knew I had no choice but to play a very different game. Not checkers, chess. And I was already 10 moves ahead. Now, as I sit on a weathered chair at the end of that very dock, my dock with a cold beer in one hand and the sun setting over the glassy water, I watch a scene that feels almost cinematic. Dozens of angry HOA members are gathered by the shoreline, their fishing poles useless, their frustration rising with each wasted minute. Why? Because the only access point to the lake that meets competition regulations is now mine, and closed, to them. And it's the only week that matters, fishing season, the Lakeside Festival, a 40-year tradition drawing crowds from towns miles away, a celebration, a competition, a deep-rooted annual ritual, and today it's come to a halt. Sometimes, justice isn't served in a courtroom. Sometimes it's served on your own land, with patience, paperwork, and an intimate understanding of the law. And just so you know, this story is about to go places you won't believe. Let me take you back to how this all began. Emma and I bought her late grandfather's lakefront cabin because it felt like returning to something sacred. She had spent her childhood summers there, long days of fishing, reading in the sun, and stories by the fire with her grandfather. For me, a remote IT engineer who spent most of my life behind screens and virtual servers, the idea of walking out of my back door to my own private dock was almost mythical. The cabin needed work, sure, but the dock? It was a masterpiece of time and craftsmanship. Built by Emma's grandfather in 1962, its planks had softened and silvered from the decades of sun and rain. The water lapped gently beneath it, whispering secrets of generations. And I remember standing there the day we signed the papers, watching a base leap near one of the posts and thinking, this is where I'm meant to be. There was something almost sacred about it. And to Emma, it wasn't just wood and nails. It was memory. Her grandfather had carved his initials into one of the support beams when he finished building it. The letters were faded but still visible, a signature of legacy. I set up my home office overlooking the lake. My days became a rhythm of digital meetings and code, followed by long, quiet evenings fishing off the dock. For 2 beautiful weeks, life was perfect. Most of the neighbors were friendly, if somewhat aloof. Many only visited seasonally. A few stopped by with welcome baskets. The most memorable was Victor Ramirez, a retired Marine who lived a few doors down. Nice to have some year-round folks moving in, he said, handing me a tin of homemade jerky and a warm handshake. This place comes alive in the summer. And it did. Everyone talked about the Lakeside Festival like it was sacred tradition. For 40 years, the community had hosted a fishing tournament unlike any other. Big prizes, music, vendors, cookouts, dancing, fireworks, you name it. Families planned their vacations around it. Kids grew up waiting for the day they could enter the youth fishing division. Locals passed down secret spots like family heirlooms. The more I learned, the more excited I became. I was already picturing myself joining the base competition, something I'd dreamed of since I was a boy but never had the chance to do. Until now. And then it arrived. A white envelope in the mailbox, stamped with the Lakeside Shores HOA seal. Inside was a formal notice. My dock was in violation of HOA regulations and had to be removed within 30 days. I stood in my kitchen reading it 3 times over, unable to comprehend. The dock had been there for over 60 years, long before the HOA even existed. I called the number listed on the letter. A brisk female voice answered. Lakeside Shores Homeowners Association, this is Eleanor Blackwood. I introduced myself and explained the situation. Her response was syrupy and smug. I understand your concern, Mr. Turner, she said. in a tone that made it clear she didn't. But our regulations clearly state that all lakefront structures must comply with current architectural guidelines. Unfortunately, your dock does not. I pushed back, reminding her that the dock was older than the HOA itself. Yes, but since ownership has changed, she interrupted, it is no longer protected. New owners must bring non-compliant structures up to code or remove them. I kept calm, but every word from her mouth made my jaw tighten. I believe grandfathered structures are protected under state law, I said. She gave a dry chuckle. This isn't constitutional law, Mr. Turner. This is Lakeside Shores. Our covenants are clear. I suggest you read them. I ended the call with a polite but firm promise to review the matter legally. That evening, as I took the trash out to the bins at the end of our gravel driveway, I overheard voices coming from just beyond my property line. I froze. It was Eleanor, and a man I didn't recognize at the time but later learned was Marcus Reed, another HOA board member. I don't care about heritage, Eleanor snapped, pointing back at my dock. That damn thing blocks my view of the lake. Besides, we need that space for the new fishing pier this year. Marcus nodded. We'll just say it's out of compliance. No one will question it. I ducked back into the shadows, heart pounding. In that moment, the mask came off. This wasn't about compliance. This was about control, power, territory, and unfortunately for Eleanor Blackwood, she had just started a war with the wrong man. The next morning, I cleared my schedule and dove into research. If knowledge was power, I was going to arm myself to the teeth. I downloaded every HOA document available, filed requests for property records from the county clerk, and scoured the state's property law archives. I looked up riparian rights, structural grandfather clauses, and legal precedents. Emma brought me lunch at my desk, her eyes filled with concern but her voice steady. Grandpa always said he made sure to get the permits when he built that dock, she said. He was obsessed with doing things the right way. That sparked a new angle. I reached out to the local archives for historical permits. Hours later, buried in a dusty scan from 1962, I found it. A valid permit issued to Harold Bennington, Emma's grandfather, for dock construction and permanent mooring rights. More importantly, I confirmed that under state law, structures built before an HOA is established are protected, and riparian rights guaranteed my legal access to and from the water. I wasn't just in the right, I was bulletproof. The more I uncovered, the more everything clicked into place. This festival wasn't just a fun summer tradition, it was the economic engine of Lakeside Shores. Local businesses depended on the tourism it brought. Many made up to a third of their annual income during the festival. The dock Eleanor wanted removed was essential for the main stage of the fishing competition, and my property, my dock, was the only one with deep water access approved for tournament use. In other words, I held the key to their crown jewel, and I wasn't letting go. My breakthrough came with an unexpected ally. Walter Graham, a retired attorney and longtime resident with a reputation for quietly resisting HOA overreach. When I explained the situation, he invited me over for coffee. Eleanor tried to make me repaint my house 5 years ago, he said with a chuckle, pouring a strong brew laced with something stronger. Said the navy blue violated aesthetic standards. I showed her the original bylaws. There were no color rules when I bought this place. She backed off. Walter reviewed my findings, nodded slowly, then helped me draft a formal response. It was polite, ironclad, and legally devastating. I attached the original permit, the property deed, and copies of relevant state statutes and case law. I emailed it to the HOA and braced for impact. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Sophia Lynn Charles, a neighbor I barely knew. I heard about the dock, she said. Just be careful. Eleanor doesn't like being challenged. When we installed solar panels last year, she made our lives hell for months, even though we had every right. 3 days later, I received a certified letter summoning me to an emergency board meeting. I didn't flinch. I called Walter. Want to come? I asked. His grin was wide and wicked. Wouldn't miss it. As we walked out the door that evening, he clapped a hand on my shoulder. Eleanor once told me my house was the wrong color, so I painted the trim darker. Let's go remind her that sometimes the rules cut both ways. And just like that, the opening gambit was over. Now it was time to play the middle game.